Okay, welcome back to Surviving in IT with .NET Core 3.1. This is part 3 of this series, creating a monthly financial report. And this series is covering all this data, all this information here, creating a database, creating dummy data, monthly table, connecting that monthly table with the financial data in a stored procedure. So we're now dealing with creating a .NET 3.1 API, and just want to go ahead and mention all the other stuff we plan to cover in this series. So we'll be adding entity framework. We'll use Postman to display data. Then we'll be adding Swagger documentations for API, Serilog for logging stuff from the API. Then when we're done with that, we're going to create an ASP.NET Core application 3.1, 3.1 MVC application, and then we're going to consume that API, and then we will display that data into data tables. So that's what we'll be covering. So let's start creating an API. Okay, let's get started here. We're going to create a new project. About to create an API, very basic one. Then I will add thing and stuff to it. Okay, now in this step, we're gonna go with the web core web ABSP .NET Core web application. This one, if you don't have it in your recent projects list. Okay, now we're gonna name this project, and we'll call it Funny Money. No, oops, whoa, I'm going too far. Mm-hmm. .api. That's what this project will be named. Get off there. And so we're going to name it Financial Report Services API, name of the project. The solution report will be Financial Report Services. And now we'll have a location I want to put this code in. And so you pick the location you want. That's where I want to have it. And then I'm going to go ahead and click Create. Oh, we're in luck. It has the API selected project. Now we'll take the default API template, click on Create. We'll just be patient here and let it do its little processing. Shouldn't take that long. And what we're going to do now after this is, well, I think we're going to start adding entity framework to all of this. So I'll just pause right here and then come back when all of this is done. So there we go. This is the base template after you create the API on my machine. Okay, here we go. So, of course, this is the default controller that comes along with it. So next thing we're gonna do is go ahead and add entity framework core. So we just created the web API, and we're just going to talk briefly about entity framework and then include it into the project. Entity framework is a lightweight, extensible, open source and cross-platform version of the popular entity framework data access technology. EF Core can serve as an object relational mapper, enabling .NET developers to work with databases using .NET objects and eliminating the need for most of the data access code that we usually need to write. Entity Framework can access many different databases and plugins and libraries, and those are all called providers. So that's the academic high overview of what Entity Framework. And there are a lot of providers out there for Entity Framework for different database sources. We're using SQL Server in this case, but you're definitely not limited to just SQL Server. Now we're going to get into the NuGet packet and adding it in here very quickly. Thank you very much. Oof. Okay, we're going to go ahead and add Entity Framework here. So we're going to right click, go to NuGet package, Entity Framework core, and make sure you specify core instead of Entity Framework. So two different packages. Now this here is the core stuff for Entity Framework. But because we're definitely working in the SQL database, there are certain things that you have to be aware of. Like if I went with Entity Framework Core and install it, then I'd have to install other packages to get everything installed needed for a database. In this case, because we're using SQL Server, we should select Entity Framework Core.SQL Server and hit install here, and you'll see that it installs all of its dependencies, so everything that it needs for SQL Server. So there is the Entity Framework Core, the extraction, in-memory stuff. So it gets you everything you want by selecting that package and all of its dependencies. So that's what I would recommend if you were using SQL Server as your data source. All right. So in the interest of time, what I did is write a lot of the code. And so we're just going to go over what I've done in the MoneyWorks DB context. And so in this class, I added the DB context, and the DB context is referencing this namespace. Is referencing this namespace, and like usual, if you type it out, Visual Studio will allow you to add it automatically. Then, of course, we have the data set for the sales order. What that does is this is where we're going to be putting the sales order data, but it allows Entity Framework to track changes in the sales order table. And so, oops, didn't realize that wasn't connected. So that's what we're getting here. This is the sales order data that we've already worked our way through. Sorry, a lot going on here. Let's minimize that real quick. Get back to now. When we are using Entity Framework, we have several. In this case, I wanted to override this DB builder, and I created this function here, which is something different. But so we have our sales order, we have our MoneyWorks, and this is our constructor. So let's take a look at what I put here in this constructor. And this constructor is working together to make sure that in the startup everything works. DI injection, dependency injection works out correctly. All right. So what I'm going to do, instead of writing code to manually connect to our database, I'm actually putting it inside of this configuration file. And this is the connection string on my local machine. And so when I go into my startup, I'm going to configure service. The configure service is what allows us to do that dependency injection. So they the services already has Control V, and it will be in this list to add DB context. So that's what you're seeing right here, where we're adding that DB context. And of course, again, it references our framework. And so anytime we can now inject our DB context into any function, and then we configure options here. And in our case, we're using SQL Server. And so that SQL Server is reading from configuration, get configuration string from our JSON, our app settings JSON. So I don't know what I changed. And then it has enable sensitive data logging enabled. And so every time it makes a reference, it's a new connection. And this right here stops it from tracking behavior. But because we're always creating a new connection, it's absolutely useless to not have this set. So you should set it to no tracking. And I added something on my own that is, I also inject the default configuration. And it's so that it allows me to get configuration values from the same location, from the same place as this, same connection string. And I'm using dynamic expando data. And what this really does is allow me to make other calls to the database, and hopefully I'll be able to get you an example of that. And this seems like a lot, but this is fairly routine. This right here is fairly routine when you're dealing with SQL Server. You know, it's kind of a copy, paste, modify deal. So once that happens, I did something here. Let's see, the properties. I went and looked at launch settings, and in your launch settings, this is going to be pointing someplace else. I'm pointing this to our API sales order, which doesn't exist right now. So once all of this is set up, and I mean, ignoring that, you know, you're putting your connection string here. You're going to the startup here, making sure it's can be injected, and make sure it's taking all your options that you want by default when it's injecting. Setting this up, there's more things you can do in on configuring, but we're not really getting here into that. This is just kind of my little cheat that I use, and so I'm just kind of showing this. I put this all the time because not every time I'm gonna want the entire object. Sometimes I just want a little special list, and you know, I don't want to go create another class. I just want to grab what I want and use it. It just varies in how I want to use it. So I deleted the controller that came here by default, which was some sort of weather forecast. And so I'm going to go here and add controller. And I'm going to use the very last item here to speed us along with the encap. Speed us right here along. So with this template, and so API control action for, and so it already knows to go check. And so sales order, we don't have that many classes in here. So this is our sales order class in our domain, and correct. And I'm gonna keep the default name, and so add it, and I'm gonna pause the recording while it does its little thing. It's gonna go ahead and start creating all that stuff for us. Hopefully he's not that. Oh, it didn't take that long at all. So here it is, API controller, and that's going to be substituted with the controller name here, and that's the actual route, which leads us back to this and why I changed it. So I just wanted to show you that process because I had changed this, but this is just saying what is the default launch URL. Altogether, we're going to eventually deactivate all of that anyway. But here we go. And so by default, when we launch it, it's going to go and call to sales order. And as you can see here in this controller, action, it's going to go reference to DB context. So when we inject it in here, it's given us reference to the MoneyWorks DB context. But because of our settings here in the startup class, this is where all our default connection string occurs, and in that and that's what we're passing in these options into our constructor, which then says, hey, this is the options that's going to say to use the SQL Server, and it's going to pass that on to the base, set our change tracker query and tracking behavior to no tracking, and then my little pass the configuration into here so that I could go ahead and re-grab the connection string for other little commands I want to run against the database using the same connection string. All right. And so in theory, when I hit run here, this launch setting is going to go straight here, and it's going to make this call, and let's see if it works. If it doesn't, I'm probably going to pause the video, stop recording. Let's bring it on over here. It's doing its thing, and there we have it. And so that's one of the pros of Entity Framework. It takes a few steps, coding that stuff, but that's fairly routine. That's happening all the time. And then I'll go ahead and deactivate all that launching of the site thing. We got properties. Build. Where is it? Yeah, when we're debug, we're not gonna launch in the browser. Yes. We'll just keep referencing that. Well, I think that's it. Project and save. Sorry, I didn't test this, but they should have just not given us anything there. Oops. Yes. Gives you this pop up. It's giving me like a certificate. And so that is our service running. Initially, I had it open up in a browser, but we're, APIs are not necessarily browser dependent. Actually, they're not. They just get called. And so now this service is started. So it allows us to use applications like Postman. Control. Uh-oh. And there's our Postman. We hit send. Uh-oh. What did happen wrong here? So I need to see why. Whoops. That did I get the properties? Sorry. This is running. Oh. Sorry. Oh boy. I have to create a application URL here for me, and I'll use this one. And I don't know. I guess that'll do. So when you're not using the browser, you have to specify the application URL when you run it locally on your machine, and you select the port number. And I'm just gonna. mm, Excuse me. Mm, We'll just stick with that. Hit save. Hopefully run it again. Okay. Now listening on localhost 14 slash API sales order. Okay. Well, I'm glad that went wrong. And there's our data. Woo-wee. That's all the data that we have exactly in our database. And if we look at it, we can see this is a sales order ID 1. And if we check the database, sales ID 1, case of water 1450, date. Voila. I mean, we're up and running here. And there's all the tracking going on. Get into that. So that was the little snafu I did here. I wasn't sure if I needed to enable native bug debugging. We'll find out soon enough. So I'm going to start this project so we can just quickly go over. This was set to IIS Express, which made the browser open. And then we set it to project. We're not going to use the browser. This is the launch browser that was in the settings. So you can see here that it's reading here API sales order. And then we had to set up a localhost port that it was going to be looking for. And that port, we went with that port and API sales order, which would automatically send us into this controller, API API get sales order, yes. Mm-hmm. Um, and which returns all of the goodies. So this is telling you if we wanted to reference this sales order, we'd have to this get statement. We'd have to hit run here, and so all of this was templated on its own. I just did this so everything's quick and easy. And so let's pick an ID. We'll 68. Oh, that's not there. We go for hot dogs 14. I don't have to copy that, but I do have to run it. Run, Forrest, run. All right, now listening. And we're going to go back to Postman. And we're going to put a 14 at the end of this. And now call it. And there it is. Hot dogs. $3. Everything. All right. Thank you so very much. Sorry this one is a little long.